She was the opposite of everything Henry VIII had once desired. Quiet where others were bold. Pale where others shone. Jane Seymour moved through the glittering halls of court like a shadow, observant, careful, and utterly aware that her silence gave her power. Born into a noble yet unexceptional family around 1508, Jane had no grand expectations. She was not trained in politics or poetry, but in needlework and household management, skills befitting a Tudor lady. Yet, as fate would have it, she would ascend to the very highest rank a woman could hold in England, Queen. She entered the royal court as a lady-in-waiting, first to Queen Catherine of Aragon and later to the fiery Anne Boleyn. From both she learned. Catherine showed her dignity in suffering, and demonstrated the cost of ambition. Jane, clever in her stillness, absorbed it all. By 1536, Anne's glitter had faded. Her failure to provide a male heir had begun to poison her relationship with Henry. Rumors swirled. Miscarriages, confrontations, political enemies. In this turbulence, Jane emerged like a ghost of virtue. When Henry began to court her, Jane did not respond with flirtation or charm. She recoiled, at least publicly. She returned his coins and gifts. She insisted on being treated not as a mistress, but as a potential wife. And Henry, tired of battle, tired of argument, found her restraint irresistible. The queen must fall for another to rise. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed on charges of adultery and treason, charges many historians believe were orchestrated. The very next day, Jane Seymour was betrothed to the king. 11 days later she was queen. As queen, Jane avoided politics. She made no enemies. Her motto was simple: bound to obey and serve. Yet she was no mere ornament. She advocated quietly for the restoration of Princess Mary, Henry's daughter by Catherine, and she softened his rage with her gentle manner. But she knew better than to push too hard. Her strength was submission, and she wielded it with intent. Then, in October 1537, came her moment of triumph and tragedy. After a long and painful labor, Jane gave birth to Edward, Henry's long-awaited male heir. The bells rang. The court rejoiced. Henry wept. But Jane, already weakened, began to fade. She died just 12 days after childbirth, likely from postnatal infection. She was only queen for 17 months, but she had succeeded where others had failed. She had given the king a son. In Henry's eyes, she remained his true wife. He buried her beside him at Windsor, the only one of his 6 queens to share his tomb. Though Jane Seymour's body was laid to rest within the cold stone walls of St. George's Chapel at Windsor, her presence lingered like a sanctified echo in the corridors of Tudor power. She had been queen for little more than a year, but in that time she had accomplished what no other wife of Henry VIII could. She had given England its prince. For the aging and battle-wearied king, this act secured Jane a sacred place in his heart. He ordered her embalmed and dressed in rich robes of royalty, her bier carried by torchlight through a grieving court. Unlike the dramatic downfalls of Catherine or Anne, Jane's exit was shrouded in reverence. There were no trials, no exile, only solemn mourning. Henry himself wore black for 3 months, longer than he had for any of his wives. But Jane's legacy did not end in death. In truth, her influence was only beginning. Her brothers, Edward and Thomas Seymour, rose swiftly through the ranks of royal favor, carried upward by the breath of royal blood. The birth of Prince Edward gave them proximity to the throne, and they would soon become 2 of the most powerful men in England. Edward Seymour, the eldest, was eventually named Lord Protector of the realm when young Edward VI became king after Henry's death. Behind closed doors, whispers began to stir. Had Jane's family orchestrated her rise as queen? Had her brothers advised her to play the part of the obedient, silent maiden to catch the king's eye? Perhaps. But no proof was ever written, only ambition cloaked in mourning. And Edward VI, Jane's son, a boy king born of her sacrifice, bore her quiet features. Pale, contemplative, slight of frame. She lived on in him, in the high Tudor cheekbones and downturned mouth, in the Protestant reform she had quietly believed in. He was her echo, delicate, intelligent, and tragically brief. But the court, like time itself, did not pause. It moved relentlessly onward. New queens came and went. Henry remarried 3 more times, but none held the same sanctity in his mind as Jane. Anne of Cleves was annulled. Catherine Howard was executed. Catherine Parr outlived him. But only Jane Seymour was chosen to lie beside him for eternity. Her memory was curated by those who came after, romanticized in paintings, softened in chronicles, polished into the image of the perfect queen, docile, loyal, fertile. She became the symbol of virtuous womanhood in a brutal age, celebrated not for rebellion or reform, but for quiet survival. A queen whose power came from knowing when not to challenge the king. And yet, her story is more than tragic motherhood. It is the story of a woman who outmaneuvered a court of lions by walking softly, of a queen who claimed her throne not through seduction but silence. As Prince Edward grew under the watchful eyes of tutors and counselors, the shadow of his mother lingered quietly behind the throne. Jane Seymour had died a queen, but in her death she elevated her bloodline to the heart of England's destiny. Her son was not only heir to the crown, he was the embodiment of a new age. And with him rose the Seymours. Edward Seymour, Jane's eldest brother, was now Earl of Hertford, and upon Henry VIII's death in 1547, he became Lord Protector of England, effectively ruler during the boy king's minority. It was a stunning ascent for a family that just a decade earlier had held no royal ties. Edward governed with confidence, championing Protestant reforms in line with his nephew's schooling and his sister's quiet convictions. But ambition has a price. Edward's grip on power drew enemies, and his brother, Thomas Seymour, proved to be reckless and dangerously hungry. Thomas married Henry's widow, Catherine Parr, in secret and attempted to manipulate the young King Edward through charm and calculated familiarity. His most scandalous pursuit, however, was the teenage Princess Elizabeth, a potential bride and a threat to the stability of the realm. Eventually Thomas's schemes caught up with him. He was arrested for treason, accused of plotting to abduct the king and control him directly. In 1549 he was executed at the Tower, a humiliating disgrace for Jane Seymour's brother, once elevated by royal favor. Edward Seymour too would fall. Despite his reforms and initial success, his autocratic rule and unpopular decisions made him many enemies within the council. By 1552 he too was accused of treason. He was executed under the reign of his own nephew, Edward VI, a bitter irony that echoed the ruthless politics of the Tudor court. The Seymours had flown too close to the sun. Jane had raised them up, and the weight of her crown had brought them crashing down. Yet through all of this Jane's image remained untarnished. In fact, as the Tudors crafted their legacy, they worked to sanctify her memory. The Protestant writers of Edward's reign portrayed Jane as the ideal queen, pious, obedient, and divinely chosen to bring forth England's Protestant heir. Elizabeth I, too, preserved Jane's place in history with calculated reverence. Though Elizabeth's own mother, Anne Boleyn, had died condemned and vilified, even she never publicly maligned Jane. To attack Jane was to attack Edward, and by extension the stability of the Tudor dynasty. Portraits of Jane painted after her death reveal a curious truth. In them she is not just depicted as queen, but as almost saintly. Pale, crowned, gentle, often holding the infant Edward like a Madonna figure. She was no longer merely Henry's third wife. She was the mother of the future, the queen who died for England's son. And yet, we must ask, how much of this was truly Jane? How much of her story was molded by those who survived her? The Jane Seymour remembered by history was not the woman who lived and breathed within the walls of Wulfhall or Hampton Court. That woman, discreet, calculating, and possibly far more politically aware than her contemporaries claimed, was soon swallowed by legend. After her death, Jane was transformed into something England needed, a symbol. The years that followed were hungry for stability. The country had torn itself apart over wives and religion, heirs and heresies. And Jane, so conveniently dead and unable to contradict the stories told about her, became a blank canvas for royal propaganda. To Protestant reformers she was the chosen vessel, the one who bore the Protestant king, Edward VI, whose reign, though brief, was seen as a step away from papal darkness. Jane had died before Henry's violent religious swings turned against the old faith or embraced the new entirely, which made her a safe figure for both sides to claim. She had no public scandal. No enemies at court. No speeches that could be twisted. No lovers. No surviving letters of ambition or conspiracy. She was, to some, the very definition of a Tudor ideal, the obedient wife, the quiet queen, the perfect mother. But history is never simple. Behind the veils and oil portraits, Jane's quiet ascent during Anne Boleyn's downfall raised more than a few suspicions, even among her contemporaries. Some believed her family plotted Anne's demise, whispering in the king's ear, subtly pushing the narrative of Anne's failure, while Jane waited in the wings. She had refused Henry's gifts not because she was pure, they argued, but because she had been taught to seem so. A performance, not virtue. Even in the centuries after her death, historians remained divided. Was Jane Seymour a victim of her time, a woman played by forces greater than herself, Or was she a master of silent strategy, outmaneuvering and Bullen not with fire but with frost? Artistic portrayals echoed this split. In Holbein's portrait she is pale and composed, her hands folded, her gaze subdued, almost otherworldly. No other of Henry's wives is painted with such stillness. In literature she is alternately cast as the gentle martyr or the cold opportunist. To some she is the Madonna. To others the mourning dove with a serpent's sense. What is certain is that Jane's brief queenship cast a long shadow. She became the standard against which all later queens would be measured, especially in Henry's eyes. He never wore mourning for his other wives. He never called any other his true queen. He chose to be buried beside only Jane. Even Elizabeth I and Bullen's daughter maintained Jane's memory with wary respect. She never publicly condemned the woman whose rise came at her mother's fall. Perhaps she understood what it meant to survive in a world where powerful women were constantly being measured, judged, and sacrificed. Jane Seymour's life may have lasted only 30 or so years and her reign a mere 17 months, but she stands at the very center of the Tudor mythos, the quiet heart in a thunderstorm of queens, the one who succeeded where others failed, not through rebellion or brilliance but through restraint. And yet, what might she have become had she lived? And yet, what might she have become had she lived? This question has haunted historians and storytellers alike. Would Jane Seymour, given the chance, have emerged from the shadows of obedience to shape the kingdom as queen and mother of the future king? Would she have acted as regent for Edward VI, guiding the Protestant transformation from the safety of her quiet wisdom? Or would she have been pushed aside like so many other royal women, her usefulness exhausted with the birth of a son? We will never know. Jane's death preserved her. It froze her in time, untarnished, uncomplicated. Unlike the other 5 wives of Henry VIII, Jane Seymour never lived long enough to fall from grace. She was spared the king's wrath, the political intrigues of court, the jealousies of stepchildren, and the perilous expectations of queenship. She died adored, idealized, the perfect queen of a deeply imperfect king. Her son Edward VI would live only 15 years. His reign was marked by reform and frailty. He never knew his mother, yet he carried her legacy as the last hope of Tudor continuity. His early death in 1553 extinguished the direct Seymour bloodline from the throne and threw the kingdom into yet another storm of succession. As for Jane's brothers, their rise and ruin became a cautionary tale. Power without permanence. Influence without legacy. They reached for crowns without ever wearing them, their names now footnotes in the grander shadow of Jane's. But Jane Seymour remained. Not in voice, for she left behind no letters of consequence. Not in action, for her reign was too short to change policy. But in myth, in image, in memory. She lies still today beside Henry VIII at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, the only wife he chose to share eternity with. Not Catherine of Aragon, the woman he fought Rome to leave. Not Anne Boleyn, for whom he tore the kingdom apart. Only Jane. In that final resting place she is queen forever. Not the most brilliant, not the most beautiful, but in Henry's mind the most beloved. And so ends the story of Jane Seymour, the quiet queen who changed a dynasty, the ghost who gave England its fragile prince, and the woman whose silence spoke louder than all the others.